Everyone, I hope that you can hear me.
Of course, we can.
Great. Well, it is a great privilege for me to join you all. I am currently in the United Kingdom, in Wales. The sun is shining. I hope you will bear with me with my British accent. And I'm going to enjoy this session with you. I feel privileged to be able to be here. Thank you very much, Dr. Gurinder Singh, for your welcome, and to Professor Katie. You really are a very warm, I can see a warm Amity family, and it's great for me to be able to take part in the ADM AA series. Now, I'm going to ask that I'm going to try and ask some questions as we go. We'll see how we get on, but one of the issues is that I think there's a lot of people on this call. So I hope we will be able to still have some level of interactivity, even though we have so many people on this call. I just want to double check that everybody can hear me okay, everyone can see the screen. Can someone let me know that it's all coming over?
It's working perfectly fine, Professor Thompson.
Thank you. Well, let me know if something goes wrong. So my topic for you, ladies and gentlemen, is attributes of wise leadership. And this is a study I've made over many years. Although I have engaged in research over the years with a couple of institutions, I'm also a business guy. So I've run businesses, and therefore I've had to straddle both, if you like, the business academic field and the pragmatic dealing with business. And of course, you can imagine right now that two businesses that I'm a director of are facing up to the need for wise leadership. And I'm sure each one of you is being challenged to make wise decisions in extraordinarily difficult times. So let's see what we can learn from research insights. I mean, I begin with something that I think we're increasingly aware of. If we weren't, the business world is complex. In fact, any dimension of the world, educational world is complex. Geopolitics is becoming more complex. And as we face complexity, we are at great strains to use the faculties and the tools at our disposal in order to address complex situations. Andy Haldane is the chief economist at the Bank of England. And I remember him saying in one of his speeches that applying complex decision rules in a complex environment may be a recipe not just for a cock-up, but a catastrophe. And there you have it from an economist who is looking at all the economic rules, the financial and fiduciary duties of a national bank, and facing huge challenges in a complex world. So we often come to this complex world with fact-based thinking, with a scientific method, and we have our processes, we have our tools, we have our methods, we have our data to help us come to logical, rational decision making. And of course, in so many situations, that is what we need. If we're looking at our financial accounts, we need proper scientific method, we need financial models, and we have the tools to do that. You know, and I know, as we face the world as it currently is and all of its complexity, that actually even these rules and models aren't enough, because we face wicked problems. And I can assure you that the idea of a wicked problem is actually a real notion. It was originally generated by two Berkeley professors, Professors Rittell and Weber, in 1973, when essentially they recognized that a wicked problem is so difficult, we can't even define it. It's very difficult to define a wicked problem. There's no stopping rules, and there is no true or false. Even what is good and what is bad decision is extraordinarily difficult. There is no immediate solution. And of course, as I say this, we immediately think of our coronavirus as the world's big wicked problem. And we may have many great scientists and scientific methods. We have models, we have data, but we struggle to come to solutions to deal with this problem. And I just use that as an illustration. Each of you, even in your own professional worlds, can say, I know what a wicked problem is. There is no right answer. And dear friends, Professor McKenny and Rooney from the University of Queensland in Australia have done a lot of work on wisdom. And they make this point that wisdom brings discernment, clarity, and knowledge to bear on complexity and unpredictability. And right now, we are in a world of complexity, unpredictability, ambiguity, uncertainty. And of course, for many people, this breeds fear. So how do we address complexity? How do we address our fears? And how do we stand tall in facing wicked problems, small wicked problems, as well as large wicked problems? And of course, the purpose of this seminar is to talk about wisdom and the attributes of a wise leader. So I'm not sure how this is going to work, ladies and gentlemen. But
Professor Thompson, your mic is muted. Arvindji, can you please unmute the mic?
I'm sorry, can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. What I was wanting to say to everybody is it possible to just see if we can, in the chat, answer this question in maybe just a few words? It would be very interesting for me to see what wisdom means for you. What does wisdom mean for you? So if we could pause just for a minute, and could you enter the chat, your chat response to all participants, maybe one sentence. The thing with wisdom, it's so broad, there is no one answer, but fire away now. Tell me, what does wisdom mean for you? Let's see what we all say. Wow. Can you all see these responses? Sensible decisions and judgments. Keep them going. There is a great response here. Clarity, application, quality of experience, taking sensible decisions. There's a lot of you saying it's about knowledge and experience. That's coming up quite a lot. But it's the idea of intelligence mixed with experience, perception, judgment, having good judgment. Yes, that's come up a number of times. Seems to be themes here about experience, knowledge, good judgment, already gaining knowledge, deductive reasoning, which is the logical dimension. That's a good one there. Decision between right and wrong. That's the first ethical thing I've seen. There's a bit of values, ethics, good judgment. Is there anything that somebody says, we haven't put this up yet? Your chance in the next 30 seconds to put up. Logical decisions as wonder, analytical skill. Yes. I like the idea of forecasting, looking to the future. The sort of idea of it being a virtue. Virtue is one of the excellences of character, the right spirit, timely action. Well, I'll let those keep flowing, but thank you for some fabulous responses. Spirituality. I want to say something about spirituality shortly. So you've told me what wisdom means for you, and I want to give you a sense of what other if you like, organizational psychologists like David Rooney and Bernard McKenna and various researchers, what they've said when they've studied wisdom. And we can see how as we go on, what you're saying here, you know, in terms of spirituality, insight on best decisions. But you can see here in a summary of a lot of research, the quality that shapes action in ways that are likely to lead to good judgment, good decisions, and good acts, which echoes what some of you have been saying. It's according to Professor Monica Ardelt, and she's done a huge study on aging and wisdom and developed something called the 3D wisdom scale on affective, reflective, and cognitive dimension of wisdom. And she says it's associated with a multitude of positive characteristics such as ego integrity. That means you're true to yourself. It's about maturity in your judgment, your ability to relate interpersonally with people, which is about your self-awareness, your awareness of the other, and she says an exceptional understanding of life. Here's another quote here from Professor Cheer and Holt. It's not a skill or a talent, it's more associated with who we are and how we act rather than the knowledge we possess. And I think I've got one final one here, short, expert knowledge in the pragmatics of life. So it's a particular kind of knowledge. And one of the things we might go on to discuss is that knowledge in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean wisdom. It is the way in which that knowledge is applied to the pragmatics of life. Just to give you a bit of intercultural context here, because as you know, I spent some time in China. So of course, the world of China and wisdom, there's a fantastic history in Confucian wisdom with the idea of Chu. And Chu is a combination of a spirit of wisdom. It's a process of self-cultivation in which we are guided by universal principles. And actually, Chu is really part of a scheme in Confucian ethics in which it's intimately connected with being honest and trustworthy. It's to do with the dignity of the gentleman. They have a name for the gentleman, the virtuous person. So this is the idea of Yunzi, the person of talent and wisdom and an example of loyalty and altruism. So there's a deep history in Chinese history. Now, you're all going to tell me a lot more about Rajarshi leadership. I know only a little through the work of S.K. Chakravarti, but it seems to me that the idea of the king sage has with it both a deep history in the Sanskrit scriptures and writings and history that brings this idea of wisdom with power. So it's a balance against ego power, but with concepts of virtue and Rajarshi quality. So the qualities of being merciful, pure, self-controlled, seeking the welfare of others and facing every event with equanimity. And it's opposing emotions of elation and humiliation. Maybe I can give you some Greek background here as well, because for the West, Western literature and philosophy have been shaped hugely by, of course, the great ancient philosophers such as Socrates, Aristotle. Aristotle has done a lot of work on the idea of wisdom, using many different words. The idea of phronesis is translated roughly as practical wisdom. It's wisdom in the living of life, and it's the ability of combining virtue in very difficult situations. I mean, there's more to it than that, but essentially it's the practice of becoming wise and becoming virtuous over time. So very much with Aristotle, it was becoming the heroic person, living a flourishing life in every dimension through the practice, the habituation of wisdom with the other virtues. And then this idea of Sophia, the higher wisdom, which is really a spiritual concept, but the Greeks didn't express it directly in spirituality. But here I think we have something in common with the Rajarshi ideas of a transcendent overview of the world, and coming from a high point of intellectual moral virtue in a reflective transcendent mode, which we call spirituality sometimes. I'll give you a chance to ask questions somehow. I think the best thing is, do feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them, because it may be difficult to get so many of you to speak. Let me just give you a little bit of an insight from my own research some years ago at the China Europe International Business School. Here it is in Shanghai, and at CIBS I was there for about 4 years. And part of that time was to do a research which we called the Wisdom Project, and we interviewed by email and email exchange 182 senior business executives from all around the world. Actually, nearly half of them were from China, and the other half were from all around the world: Europe, Australia, South America. They were all C-suite level people, so they either owned their own business or they were senior in their businesses. We had criteria for that, and we asked a number of questions, but the key question in the survey was, what does wisdom mean for you? Just the question I've asked you, we asked them. And then we ask how they applied wisdom in their managerial decision. So I want to give you a couple of snapshots to help us move towards where we come to in our attributes of wise leadership. And the survey has been published in a number of places, so I'm happy to give you the references at the end of the session if you want to look more into the research. But here's a few snapshots from what some of the respondents said. Here's a Russian GM of an international spices company. And here I picked this one up because it's reflecting what a number of respondents said in terms of morality, this sense that there is a human orientated values in which they see wisdom as having a degree of empathy and awareness of other people in the way they make judgments. So there's an ethical dimension there. But there's also a rational dimension. A number of you were talking about logical decision making. A number of you referred to using analytics. Absolutely. And this is the thinking about wisdom, is how you integrate those rational elements with the softer, less defined elements of wisdom. How do these things move together? And this is a comment there from an senior business SBU head of a German dairy company. Then we have an HR director from an international technology group talking about the intangibility of wisdom, but we have this sense that it could even touch not only on values and character, but also intuition. You might think sometimes, I have a gut instinct, I have a feel, I can have a sense that something is going to happen, and you think, well, that's not rational. It's not. But in wisdom, there is a capacity for what we call non-rationality. It's not that it's irrational, but there are definite research elements to this idea of what's sometimes called reflective wisdom. The ability by which we reflect, we use intuition. A number of you referred to experience. And I think that's one of the things that plays into what we sometimes call intuition. We are able to amazingly put together a picture from our own experiences, and we combine that in our relationship with other people in making a decision. And here's another quote from the director of a South American Coffee Growers Association talking about not just the rationality of facts and knowledge, but the ability to understand the context, to be able to read a situation well, and to be sensitive to others in the decision-making process. Now, there's some quotes. I'm going to just give you now 3 survey top lines. Of course, there are many, but I want to get through quite a lot in this short hour and give you time for a Q&A somehow. Here's one thing that came out from this survey, that it seems to be an integrating capacity, which brought additional valuable perceptual characteristics into managerial decision-making. By that, we mean there's a perceptivity in which managers are able to integrate both rational thinking with perceptions that we might otherwise regard as not immediately visible, but this, if you like, sixth sense in which we're able to read a pattern. We can maybe look at forecast data, but we have a capacity to look at that data and gain insight. And that insight is a combination of many things, but I hope and think that wisdom is part of our ability to read and interpret those deeds, to look at a context and to make a decision from any of those known facts, and to integrate an ethical sensitivity in the making of a decision because of our heightened, developed awareness of other people, our ability to sense them, and to do that in a respectful way. And of course, all of you as senior experienced faculty and researchers and students will, I'm sure, in life have discovered the importance of being other aware. And this is a sign of wisdom, your capacity to develop your awareness of another person and to respond to them as best you can in respect for them and their culture, their background and their views is a mark of wisdom. And I often notice this in the hallmark of great wise leaders. And I want you right now to be thinking, because I'm going to be asking you who you would think is a wise leader and what are their characteristics. So start thinking of that now, because I'm going to be asking you. But when I think about wise leaders and I look at some great leaders, you know, whether in the business world or the political world, I could think of recently retired Paul Pullman, who's very well known for his work as CEO of Unilever and in really trying to help change the world to be a better place. He's a humble man, actually. He's aware of other people. He can go into a situation in an African village and make food with the village children and be very aware of them and be able to reflect their feelings when he comes back to talk about what he's seen. This is a quality, I think, of wisdom and a wise leader. And putting that all together in a very summary way, here I think are the 5 wise attributes, or you might call them capacities. I'm not sure what else you would say, because these are capabilities that each one of us has. And our task in leadership is the way in which we personally are able to develop these capacities and are able to enjoy and benefit the personal self-development of wisdom. And from this is both from the survey that I led at CIBS, but it also, some of the thinking behind it comes from a range of different researchers, especially Bernard McKenna and David Rooney, who've done a lot of work in this area, but trying to simplify a lot of research into a simple model means that we don't do justice fully, but I hope that you'll see here there are some attributes that we can all lock onto and hopefully recognize. Let me just talk about some of them briefly. Rational capability, well, we know it's about rational information, processing data, facts, it's management, problem solving. It's applying knowledge with reason, with objectivity, with scientific process. It's a rational capability. And being wise is even if we may not be brilliant at processing data and so on. Now, I'm certainly not. I mean, my company is. I have a company that we have great data analysts. I'm not very good at it, but I respect it. I know that the results that come out should be included in the decision-making process. So rational capability is a really vital part. Then the other thing that's come through is the perception, if you like. This is the non-rational capability of insight. What is insight? Well, it's forecasting. But being able to forecast, but have a sense of using data to gain an insight into a situation. It might be intuition. You know, a number of the respondents in our survey used this idea of gut feel, this gut instinct that they had that something was right. It wasn't that they were ignoring the facts and so on, but they needed, as you do in the COVID crisis, and we'll come to an example of how do we face the COVID crisis, but you need rational facts, but often you can't trust the facts. We don't know if we can trust the data, but we still have to make judgments. I'm in a dilemma right now with one of my companies about opening up after lockdown, and we have a shared office space called the Hub in London. And the question is, what do we do? How do we keep distancing? How many people should we let in the building? Well, here we have very little data to go on. We have to rely on perception, insight, whatever information we can get, a combination, also ethical skill to safeguard people. And of course, ethical skill is all about respecting fair process, of being as truthful as we can. So this is balance between openness with discretion. So ethics is so much about being discreet about information that's confidential, but being open and honest. And this ethical skill, it needs the wisdom to balance those tensions that we find every day in ethical dilemmas, where there's no easy, straight answer, but we have to anyway find a way through that incorporates rational thinking, perception, pragmatism, emotional and ego regulation in coming to a decision by using these capacities. Now, pragmatism is all about, of course, being able to solve problems. The capacity for us to use what we have in saying, well, okay, let's be creative. Let's have a brainstorm. Let's use our pragmatic ways of operating. So, for example, in the Hub in London, we are thinking, well, being practical, how do we put up maybe a perspex screen to protect the reception area from people coming in? Do we use a thermometer and give people a thermometer to do a temperature check? I mean, these are practical outworkings, but they all have to be gap balanced by ethical skill. So we have to think about what would be the impact if we did this action on people. And this tests our awareness of how we read our members. Then, of course, emotional and ego regulation. You can't really imagine a wise person going crazy and mad regularly. I mean, I suppose in a sense, we all go crazy and mad a little bit, but generally a wise person is able to regulate their emotions. Now, we're all wired very differently, and we all have emotions moving at different spaces, but whatever our emotional landscape is, our dashboard for emotions, firstly, we need to understand our emotions so that we can manage them. And that's where this distance, this objectivity, perhaps the transcendent view where we reflect and observe ourselves and how we behave is really important. Now, I'm just going to see if there's any questions to see that, right, I've got a few here. I'll take a pause and answer a couple. There's some that you can see here. In the Eastern concept, wisdom said as Gan implies not shareable to others, only applied. What is the Western notion, shareable or not? I think in the West, and this is terrible because we're generalizing, we've been very much shaped by both the Aristotelian, the Greek thinking and the Christian thinking. And so in both of those, in the Greek Aristotle, it was very much focused on the individual rather than she or he would share with others. It was about perfecting yourself. It was a self-development process. Whereas in the Christian religion and the way that it's shaping, if you like, the values, the justice system, the legal system, there is the idea that wisdom can be shared insofar as faith can be shared, and with an expectation that giving and sharing is part of what we should be doing. So there may be a difference there, but I need to learn from you guys more about the Eastern concepts of wisdom. I know a little bit about Chinese, but not others. There's a question here about differentiating spirituality from religion. Gosh, that's a big question, isn't it? I suppose my top line on this, and I did do a degree in theology, that religious and religion are based on creedal, faith-based systems, and spirituality is much more universally an acceptance that we have not just a body, but a spirit, an Atman, and that spirit has got a level of being beyond and above the material world, and it gives us this capacity to connect with others and to higher beings such as God. And so this is a shorthand at my work with the SPES Institute. If anyone wants to look at the European SPES Institute, there are many papers on spirituality and what that's about. Questions about rational capability. Does a manager's emotional regulation override his or her rational capability? Goodness, I think my own experience there is that the two should sit alongside. That you know, if we're using rational data, we need to be able to, at the same time, not show an emotional bias in the way we present that rational data. And this is very difficult for us because we tend to look for something called confirmatory bias. It's just natural. We look for data that confirms our bias. Now, the idea of regulating your ego, it's got to be able to say we come to the data very dispassionately, and I'm not going to rest my reputation on whether you accept the data conclusions that they have. So to be honest, it's about the humility in which we are able to present and use data without us being attached to that data such that if it's rejected, I feel rejected. I mean, that's just an example of how I would respond to that. Being in HR, what are the skills and capabilities helpful in this pandemic situation? Obviously, I would refer to the 5 attributes straight away. That one of the things that when you're in HR is that you do have to deal with people in their moods and going up and down. And that's, of course, the case with all of us. So we have to be able to have sufficient distance in HR when dealing with people to be able to use our own emotional regulation to help others manage their own emotional regulation, if you see what I mean. If you are able to share about, is it, you know, I found it difficult too. These are the things that I found help me. But in making decisions, and I want us to look at a particular HR decision later on, so we'll come back to that question, because I want to look about how you manage to cut salary in this COVID crisis, because that needs wisdom. So I'm going to come back to that. Relationship between entrepreneurship and wise leadership. I've got a question there. I think whatever line of work you're in, whether you're in education, in politics, or whatever, I think there is a wise leadership. You can be an entrepreneur who's unwise and an entrepreneur that's wise, and I've seen both. I've worked with entrepreneurs throughout my life, and there's only one that I would say has been unwise, but has still, nevertheless, was an entrepreneur, but unfortunately created a lot of damage. Usually entrepreneurs have got a gut instinct. I find they have a high capacity of non-rational. They have a sense. For example, I worked in a toy shop for many years as an operations director, but the founder of that toy shop almost had a sense when snow would come at winter, because of course here in the UK, when the snow comes, the children buy sledges from the toy shop. But when do you release the sledges from the warehouse, and how do you get the sledges in the shops just for the time when the snow comes? I can't believe it, but almost every year he said, send the sledges out, and it was a particular time, and then the snow came. How can you explain that? He was an entrepreneur, and I see that characteristic a number of times, this gut instinct in which entrepreneurs can be able to see things that no one else can see. And many people think that they're crazy, because you say to them, well, this is not rational, this is not logical. They say, no, it isn't, but this is what I'm going to do. High risk because many fail, but we see this capacity of non-rationality and the ability to use pragmatism in making something happen, but not always so strong and always using logic. And you find that in the logic and the rational area, they employ people. The good entrepreneurs will bring in people to supplement their weaknesses, which often is to do with the rational systems that we require to build a successful business. And a wise entrepreneur will realize that they need that kind of help. I'm going to pause and press on and come to your other questions later. I want to give you an example of someone that I've been talking a bit about gut instincts. This is a business guy called Hamdi Ulukaya, who was originally from Turkey, and he moved with his family when he was young to the United States. And cutting a long story short, he bought a redundant craft food plant and started making yogurts using his mother's recipe from Turkey. I'm simplifying the story, but he then becomes famous for creating a completely new yogurt that everyone said would not work because Americans don't like straight plain yogurt. No one was making that, and he disagreed, and he said, and of course if he had done market research, that information would have been confirmed. He would have confirmed, no, we don't like this kind of yogurt. But he still went and he trusted his instinct, and he's made a successful business called Chobani, and I can't remember what the percentage market, but he created a completely new market for yogurt. Now the wisdom for that with me is that he had a sense, a deep, profound instinct, a non-rational, if you like, that it was the way to go. He was certainly an entrepreneur, and I'm sure along the way he's had to do the rational, the ethical, and everything else. But he was leading with this instinct, this intuitive sense that he trusted his instinct. Now I want to now turn to you all and give you. Sorry, in a minute I'm going to turn to you. I just want to give you another connection here. So when we're talking about the attributes of wise leadership, I was recalling some work done by Gary Hamel, who's a famous sort of strategist consultant, and his article Moonshots for Management some years ago. And in this table summarizes what he was saying in terms of what he felt the new era of management required, the kind of other capacities, if you like. And I looked at this and I thought, well, there's a lot of wise attributes within these different capacities. You can see mending the soul has got a spirituality. This idea of higher purpose is absolutely a feature of a wise leader who's not just looking for the immediate pragmatic profit loss situation, but saying, what am I doing? What am I achieving? Who am I helping? And what is my purpose? So if you like, this vocation, this call, and mending the soul is about your call, returning to your true vocation. And part of you becoming wise is to be true to yourself, to really hone in on who you are, not who other people expect you to be. And mending the soul is returning to your instincts. And I've taught many people, many MBA programs actually, and I've had sad conversations of MBA students being there because their parents want them to follow a consultancy path, but it wasn't in their heart at all. And so there's a bit of broken soul. And we need to be able to unleash capability, foster renewal, expand our minds, distribute power, seek balance. And that balance is often the ethical balance, how we make decisions, how we stretch timeframes, how we encourage people who are perhaps behind the curve on their in getting up. And so there's some big things here. You can see he talks about rethinking the philosophies of how we do management. And this to me is all examples of wise leadership, and some of the 5 features that I mentioned earlier. You can see this is an example, I think, of wise leadership or wise management from Gary Hamel. Now, to my question, ladies and gentlemen, next question for your chat. Get your chat ready. Who would you nominate as a wise leader? I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and I'm going to look at the screen. They don't need to be famous. They may be someone from your own circle, so it doesn't matter. But I want you to think, to make it real, let's think about someone that we respect, and let's put up. They might be a business leader, they might be a politician, it might be someone in your own family who you respect as a wise leader. Let's just have a look at the names. I'll give you 1.5 minutes. Someone's put their mother up, which is lovely. Father, Warren Buffett, Modi Ji, Mr. Modi, Bill Gates. Some good comments up here, by the way. I do encourage you to have a look at what your classmates are saying. There's a good question to come to there, which I'll come to about non-rational in a minute. A number of people respecting their mother and their father. There's some Chancellor of the University, Dr. Atul Chawan, our own Professor Gurinder, Angela Merkel, my PhD supervisor, Ratan Tata, Ashok Chowdhury. Well, I suppose in India, Ratan Tata has got a fantastic reputation, hasn't he? So I'm not surprised, but I'm also interested to see that Abraham Lincoln, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, Justin Trudeau, Mr. Modi. Okay, well, what we're doing there is, I think we're trying to bring to life Swami Vivekananda, who of course is a great example of Indian wisdom. Here's an example for me of someone who I think recently in the COVID crisis has displayed fabulous wisdom. Rear Admiral, not Rear Admiral Keshan, who's just come up there, but Jacinda Ardern, who is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and still relatively young, and has a family, and has touched her own nation by being very pragmatic and very wise and skillful in managing the COVID crisis in New Zealand, and has been recognised for her common touch and her respect for people in the way that she's had to respond, not just to this crisis, but also some tragedies in her own country in the last year, certainly with the volcanic eruption and the impact that had on New Zealand and so on. So now I think once we start putting up these names, and this, you can have a look at some names. I don't know many Mamata Buche, excuse my pronunciation, but there's some great Indian heroes coming up. And Michelle Obama, yes. I think what we're doing is we're saying we have a sense of who a wise person is or who a wise leader is. So when we talk about the wise attributes, it helps sometimes say, well, who do we think has got that? And then, of course, the question turns to us in terms of how we respond and how we develop ourselves to be wise. Here's someone else who I think is quite wise, John Mackey, who's the founder and CEO of the Whole Foods stores, which is now part of Amazon. And he, in many ways, the way he's managed his business, related to stakeholders, being generous, being thoughtful, but also being very shrewd as a businessman has demonstrated for me entrepreneurship with wisdom. I want to turn to end now in the last sort of quarter of an hour of us all being practical and trying to use these 5 wise attributes. And by the way, before I come back, I must answer this question: is how do we develop? There's a question about how do we develop insight in intuition. And that's a good question, because if it comes to rational capability, we all know roughly what we have to do for that. But intuition is more difficult. And of course, we have to be wise with it, because intuition can be quite risky. It takes us into an uncertainty. So my sense with this, with my own experience in how intuition and insight is developed, is to explore your own reflective moments and try them out, and start trialing your instincts in something that's maybe not so high risk, because what we need to do is to develop a own instinct. Now, that is not to ignore all the other things such as rational capability, being pragmatic, and not being in an airy fairyland, but it is to recognize that as human beings, we develop in life, we have experiences, those experiences shape our thinking. And when we reflect on a challenge, let us be open to the reflective spiritual space where we draw from the less defined capacities of our spirit, if you like, to come to a perception, our ability to perceive a situation. And much of this is to do with our ability to read other people and to read ourselves. And that is practice. It is a practice by which it starts, I think, with us being true to ourselves. So when you are really beginning to accept yourself for who you are, with your gifts, with your limitations, with your strengths and with your weaknesses, that is the beginning at which, once you're at peace with yourself, intuition can flow better. Because we all have an inner monk. A friend of mine called Ralph Adams has written a book called The Suited Monk. And I wrote another book called Suited Monk Leadership, in which you have an outer suit and you have an inner monk. And we're very good at looking after our outer suit, but not so strong at cultivating our monk. And if we're not careful, we have a small monk in a big suit, and there's a gap between the suit and the monk, this gap. And we have to close the gap. And that means we have to let go of things. We have to accept where we are in life. That's not to say we're not ambitious, but it is to say we have to be real with who we are, where our gifts are, and what the opportunities are. And then listen to our heart, soul, and spirit, listen to our friends, and reflect. So it's a reflective capacity. Now, getting back to the practical wise decision making in the COVID-19 crisis, you may have had a chance to read this just out from McKinsey, who've written an interesting article on administrative and general expenses and how they need to be managed in times of crisis. And we're in a crisis. We have the deepest and most wicked problems. I'm going to give you one to think about in a minute. But you might think right now, well, this quotation here, which talks where McKinsey in their article just out talks about the longer term need that we all have to balance the immediate need to keep our businesses going, to keep our universities going, which is how do we do that, but ensure that we tailor the spending such that we can conserve cash to take us through to the other side. And I've been in 2 businesses right in the midst of these kinds of discussions, which is how do we survive? How do we take our businesses through to the other side? And how do we do that in a way that respects our purpose and our responsibilities to all our employees, our customers and communities? This is a way of shaping a wicked problem. And right now, perhaps if somebody wants to particularly share a problem in a few sentences, feel free now to share a problem and we can maybe get some feedback on the chat. But whilst you're thinking of that, I'm going to give you a particular challenge, ladies and gentlemen. Not sure how it's going to work on chat, but it'll be maybe a few lines of your thoughts on this. It's a need for wisdom. We need all the wisdom skills of being rational, using our ethical skills, being intuitive and using our insight, controlling our ego. So it's not just about us. And we need to be pragmatic in this situation. And here, this is a company that I know. I've anonymized it, but it's a company we call ENG, which is an engineering project management company, suddenly facing a downturn in contracts due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The management were meeting in March, looking and reviewing what they could do, noticing that the forecast revenues were going to be declining. They looked at contracts, they got in touch with their clients, they talked to their project teams, and they got enough input to see how contracts were going to decline definitely between March and June, and then speculating of how it might go from July through to the end of the year. And I've given you an approximation of the forecast revenue reduction that this particular company were facing. Now, as a more of a project management, very highly skilled consulting engineers and so on, 75% of the company costs are salaries. There's not a lot of plant. There's only offices. There's no factories. There's not inventory, or it's not that kind of business. It's the talent that they're selling of the engineering project management skill, with 75% of all costs are salaries. They have 300 employees in Europe. The other piece of information you need to know is that in Europe, and I know we've got people joining us from Europe and Africa and elsewhere, and it may be in similar countries, I don't know, but certainly in Europe, many countries are offering government job retention schemes whereby instead of making people redundant, you lay them off work for a period of time. And in the UK, it's 4 months. The 4 months, the government will pay 80% of the salary to the company so that these people can be retained and not made redundant. So you need to know that information, because the challenge is, of course, what would be a wise management approach? You have to cut the salary bill. You want to avoid redundancies. How should you go about this dilemma? I've given you, if you like, some rational facts here, but we now need to use some ethical skill. We need to use some intuition. We need to think about how do we practically apply, going back to the person that asked the HR question, which is in the light of the COVID question, how do you talk to people about salary cuts or job retention schemes? I mean, how should this be managed? Should the management just come up and say, this is what we're going to do? How do they consult? I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes, ladies and gentlemen, just to give me a couple of minutes to make a few comments on chat. Just maybe 1 sentence, 2 sentences, give me some hints. I've got some coming up already. Being practical, communicative, yes. Be transparent, that is wise. And that is because you're using ethical skill. So transparency is important. So cutting down the salary, but how? How do we cut down the salary? Do we say to everybody, we're all going to cut your salary? Do we talk to them? Do we invite them? I mean, how do we do that? Yes, ask opinion of employees to help. Yeah, that sounds wise. Wait for a few more months. Keep everybody on and hope we've got enough cash. One of the things I should say is that cash will run out after 3 months. So maybe we can't wait 3 months. We have to do something quickly. Communicate, come up with different ideas. Try to be insightful and ethical at the same time, using performance pay, opinion from employees. I think the idea of transparency has come up a few times, and I think this is a key wisdom factor. Empathy. I like this idea of encouraging voluntary reductions. This particular company, that's what they did. They went in and said, look, this is the situation. They were transparent, and then they said, here are the options. Now, for some people, they recommended and asked them to go on furlough. But even then, the person could come back and say, I really can't do this because of this. We equally asked for people to volunteer, because for some people who had young children at home, they were happy to take a furlough for 3 or 4 months. I can see that some of the examples coming up here, management take a pay cut first. Exactly right, exactly right. This particular company led with the board taking a significant pay cut. Then they went to the employees and asked for, now the question, of course, ladies and gentlemen, is should we have the same pay cut for all? Question. Yes, a number of questions, people saying that we should ask the employees, that we should communicate. The idea of rationality and logical decision making, this does come in because we have to look at, we can say to people, well, look, we have applied a formula. We'd like to present this, tell us what you think about our formula, which could be thresholds. Anybody earning over, I don't know, $60,000 gets 20%. Somebody owning, 40,000 gets 15%. There's a rationale that we could put up, which is a justification, which is what someone's just said here, the cut, so that the percentage cuts are higher bracket. And this is exactly what the company did. They had a blend. And also then they said, well, if you take reduced hours, there's no pay cut, but obviously you reduce your pay by reducing hours. So, of course, yes, everybody is actually working from home anyway, so there is a reduction in cost. And that is a factor that we use. The rationality that you come into play. But the ethicality is about empathizing and being transparent. These are the two key factors. At the same time, as management, you have to be responsible. So part of the ethical skill is saying, I, as a manager, am responsible. You, as employees, we're all responsible. We share responsibility. How do we now respond? So empathetic, democratic report, absolutely. Gosh, a big question. What's my strategy for the education industry, especially in India? I tell you what, if you want to set me up for another discussion, we can have an open forum on that, because I think I need to have your data points before I could attempt an answer. Employees should not ask for full salary. That's exactly right. So I'll pause there. Thank you very much for those great responses. I'm still trying to capture if there are any more questions as we begin to wrap up now. But I think what this illustrates is that we have to be pragmatic, but all the time thinking, as you were there, of how we balance the ethical dimension with the rational dimension. So rational is, here's the facts: revenue down, costs must go down, we have to keep this business afloat. Rational fact, we present the rational fact. We then say, well, intuitively, what might be the creative ways we could do this? Well, we could cut hours, we could, somebody's got some experience from a previous crisis, let's listen to this experience, we bring our experiences, we look at our ethics and say, what kind of company do we want to be seen to be at the other side of this crisis? People who are slicing out of fear, or saying to everybody, we can't guarantee jobs, but let's do the best we can, which is an honest response, and what happened. Being pragmatic to say that, look, we know that we're all different, let's just be pragmatic, say, you tell me what would work for you, here's some offers. And then looking at the ego regulation that makes us separate somehow. It's a great leveler when you talk about salary cuts and people going on furlough, whatever level. It's a great discipline of using wise leadership. Now, as we come to our final 4 minutes, I'm going to just give you this to say, look, this is a little bit more complex way that a friend of mine called Professor Adele Gutouni at my business school, the Gustafson School of Business, came up with a really neat little model, and you can read more of it. I can let you have this detail if you want to ask me later. But here I see an example of wisdom and wise decision making. He developed the multiple criteria decision analysis, in which he looked at different points in which you can see from those axes how sustainable a decision making quality could be, and how profitable it might be, and mapping different decision points which vary from being very selfish to maximize your profits to the expense of being sustainable, and versus also being maybe too altruistic, in which you end up in potentially an unprofitable situation. So I just, these slides will be, I think, made available to you so you can study that more later. But I want to end with a Q&A. I'm going to quickly now go to the chat in the last 2 or 3 minutes to see if there are any questions that I can give any attempt to answering. Can we relate emotional intelligence to wise capacity? Yes, indeed you can. It's a very good proxy for wisdom capacity. So emotional intelligence is really what I was referring to in terms of being self-aware and other-aware. and it's intrinsic to your capacity to ego regulate, regulate yourself, know yourself, and so on. So emotional intelligence is really important. And we're into our last minute. Any other questions here? Does more empathetic make a leader appear weak? I think with empathy, I think that's an interesting point. Empathy must be given. It's through understanding the position of another person, but still being able to be distant in making the making a decision from a point of authority and responsibility, such that there's again, it's about balance. The ethical skill is balancing something like responsibility to do the right thing with empathy and understanding people. Gosh, there's lots of good questions here. Is soft HR wrong for an organization? That's a big question, because I scrapped HR and we have people services, because I wanted to emphasize the idea it's about serving people and serving the leaders. So you can take what you will from that. But our time is up, ladies and gentlemen, and it's been a great joy for me to be with you all. Thank you for the great participation and questions. I'm concluding here with a little quote from a friend of mine. Wisdom is reading the patterns of life well and applying these with insight. And I hope that each of you will go forth being aware of the capacities you have to read the patterns of life well and to apply them with insight. So very best wishes to each of you. Thank you very much.